Well, good evening. It is good to see you here this evening for the Bible study. We are continuing on in our series here in the book of Genesis, covering Genesis chapters 12 through 36. And so we're sort of picking up speed this evening. With Genesis chapter 12, the book of Genesis begins to narrow its focus. We started out in the beginning in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's pretty broad focus. That takes in everything. Then we very quickly zeroed in on humankind that God created here on the earth, the family of Adam, and focused in on the pre-flood world, and then the events quite a bit that was focused in on the events of the flood and the immediate post-flood world that were summed up there that we have gone through. Beginning in Genesis chapter 12, the Bible begins to focus in on one man, and that is Abraham, and the remainder of the Bible really carries on from that. The rest of the Bible, in that sense, is built upon the promises that God made to Abraham and the ultimate fulfillment of those promises. So that is quite a focus. Everything ultimately, all the rest of the Bible goes back and is dependent upon much of the material that we're going to cover here this evening. God chose to work through one man, through Abraham, and through his family in order to reveal His Word, His truth, His plan for mankind, to preserve His Word, to build a family, a nation. Ultimately, it was through this family that the Messiah would come. Now, from a prophetic standpoint, the main importance of these chapters that we're going to go through this evening, and those immediately following, is their development of the birthright blessings and promises. This was a continually unfolding promise, which will expand throughout the book, as we will see as we go on here through the life primarily of Abraham and Isaac, and getting into the life of Jacob. Now, as we pick up the story here in Genesis chapter 12, we find God dealing with the man Abraham, and God told him, get up out of your country, away from your kindred, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And I'll make of you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great. And there'll be... Now, what we find right here is that the promises initially are rather vague. God told Abraham, I want you to leave where you are and go to a place that I will show you. Now that is not very specific. We're told Abraham arose and went, not knowing where he went. He went in faith. And we find that God told him, I will make of you a great nation, and you go to a land that I will show you. God simply told him that he would... his descendants would become a great nation, would be blessed, and through his descendants, all nations would be blessed. But it's left pretty vague and pretty general. Now, as we go on down and advance through the story, we will see that God continually got more specific. But you see, Abraham had to respond in faith. He didn't know all the details. Humanly, we like to see where we're putting our foot. We like to see where the next step is going to be. And faith is something that goes against the grain of human nature, because we all like to walk by sight. And God called upon Abraham to walk by faith, and ultimately the basis of our relationship with God, the basis of Abraham's relationship with God was that he trusted God. That's what faith is. Abraham trusted God, and because he trusted God, it ordered his whole life. And the decisions and the consequences of his life were impacted because Abraham trusted God and he lived his life accordingly. Now, Paul develops that in the New Testament and explains how that ultimately a relationship with God in the New Testament or in the Old Testament, it's all based on the same thing. It's based on trusting God. And of course, if we trust God, truly trust Him, then we will act on what He says. You see, a lot of times the Protestants in particular try to make a distinction between faith and works. Well, you can't really separate faith from works, because if you really believe something, you act upon it. And if you don't act upon it, then it's pretty clear you don't believe it very much. So we find that Abram departed, Genesis 12:4, just as as the Lord had spoken to him. And he was 75, and Lot went with him. Now Lot was his brother's son, his nephew. And they brought all their possessions, everything they had, and they came to the land of Canaan. And when Abram came there, he passed through the land to the place of Shechem. And we're told that the Canaanites were then in the land. Now, Abraham, when he got there, found out a few things that maybe he hadn't known before. There's no indication he'd ever been here before. He gets there, and he finds out God said, I'm going to give you this place. But when Abraham looks around, somebody's already there. Now, that begins to dawn on you that this maybe isn't quite as simple as what I thought. If somebody had promised you that they were going to give you this house, this beautiful house, and you were all excited about it, and they took you there and they showed you, and you found out somebody was already living there, and the people that were living there had no plans to move. That would be a little bit disconcerting. Abraham got there. Not only did he find the Canaanites then in the land, but he found there was a famine in the land. Verse 10. It hadn't been raining for a while. He got there and it was hot and dry, sort of like what Texas has been of recent date. And so, this was, here's another disappointment. Now he's got a bunch of cattle and sheep, no pasture to feed them on. So he comes on down to Egypt. And Abraham's faith is beginning to falter a little bit at this time because he's having to get down to Egypt, go out of the land that God had promised him because the famine was severe. Well, he began to get nervous and worried and was afraid that he might be killed. So he decided to pass Sarah off as his sister. Well, there was a technicality there that Abraham was sort of leaning on because, of course, the story is that Abraham actually she was technically a half sister to Abraham, as she was as is explained in Genesis 20 verse 12. She's the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. So Sarah was a half-sister, and Abraham used that technicality to sort of fudge the truth here. And if it hadn't been for God's intervention, they'd really been in a mess. God helped him to get out of this situation. He played Pharaoh, and Pharaoh was glad to get rid of him when he realized what the situation was. In Genesis 12:20, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him. They sent him away with his wife and all that he had. And Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. This is to the southern part, to the Negev, that southern part of the land of Israel. He was very rich in livestock, silver and gold. And he came on up as far as Bethel, where he had originally pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai, and the extent of the herds and flocks were such that in that area they couldn't all stay together. They were going to have to spread out. They were going to have to do something because there was beginning to be strife among the herdsmen. And you see, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land, verse 7. So it wasn't that they could graze their stock anywhere they wanted to. There were certain areas. And so they were going to have to spread out. Well, Abram, who at this time was, Lot was his next of kin. Lot was the natural heir. Abraham had been given promises, but he and his wife had no children. So Abram said to Lot in verse 9, the whole land is before us. Just separate. You go one direction and I'll go the other. You go left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go left. Well, Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw all the plain of Jordan. He wasn't looking at the land that Abraham had been promised. He looked across the river, saw the plain of Jordan. It was well watered. And so Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and he journeyed east, and they separated. Lot, verse 12, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain. So what we find is that Lot distanced himself here, but he distanced himself not in the land, but going on outside the land and going on over. And the area, Lot was a little bit short-sighted. You know, he took what he thought looked best from a human standpoint, which was, here he was sort of a tag-along, but nevertheless he was, when he got the opportunity, he took what he thought looked best. And we find that he pitched his tent, verse 12, he pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Now, people in Sodom weren't just your ordinary run-of-the-mill sinner. They were sinners exceedingly. They went over and above the call of duty, you know. And so the first mistake, we find that Lot made a series of choices. And, you know, our choices have consequences. And Lot made some choices. Initially, you see, he was a little on the greedy side. He was going to pick what looked best to him and take advantage of having first choice. So he took the land the land of Jordan and pitched his tent toward Sodom. Got as close to Sodom as what he could. He began to get entangled with that. And what we're going to find as we go on through is that Lot became increasingly entangled in the affairs of Sodom. Rather than keeping his distance from the society around him, Lot became so enmeshed in it that it wound up and ultimately his whole family was pulled into this whole situation. You know, it's not that Lot did everything that the Sodomites did, not by any means. But he put himself in a situation where he was in a bad environment, and that particularly affected his children. And there's an interesting contrast if you look at the next generation, the family of Abraham and the family of Lot. Because you find that God said of Abraham a little bit later when he was talking about the land, when he was talking about the promises, and he said, for I know him, that he will command his children and his descendants after him. Notice here in Genesis 18, verse 18. God's talking about Abraham, and he says, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, for I've known him. In order that, you know, God says, I know him. That he will command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he's spoken to him. You see, God knew Abraham, and he knew Abraham was going to train and teach his family and to orient them toward the truth so that God would be able to bring about the blessings that he had in store for Abraham. So that's what we find, that there became increasingly a contrast between the family of Lot and the family of Abraham. Now, Abraham was a little bit discouraged after Lot had left, and God told him in Genesis 13:14, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, north, south, east, west, for all the land which you see will I give to you and your descendants. And I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth. And he told him to arise and walk in the land through its length and width. Now, God begins to carry the promises a little further. You know, first he just told him, go to a land that I'll show you. Now he points out to him what land this is and gives him some specifics here of the size of it. We'll find later God begins to further develop this promise. Now, in Genesis chapter 14, we're introduced to a couple of things. One, there was an alliance of kings that stretched from what is now modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, across into Mesopotamia. And this alliance of kings invaded the Middle East, and Sodom, which was right at a crucial point in terms of the caravan routes coming up out of Egypt and from other areas, was a central city here. So we find that Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked this area, and they captured Lot. And they weren't going after Lot, they were just going after Sodom. And they took all of it captive. In verse 11 of chapter 14, they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, his nephew, who dwelt in Sodom. But this time Lot had moved into Sodom. First he pitched his tent toward Sodom, now he moved in. He keeps getting a little closer. Well, now this should have told him a lesson. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time and goes and is hauled off captive. Well, when Abram found out about it, he gathered together his trained servants and went on pursuit after this invading army, and he met them here in the valley of the Kings, and he was able to defeat them, and so they came on back. Now, in verse 18, we're introduced to a remarkable individual that just sort of comes on the scene abruptly. Abram is coming back from the slaughter of the kings. He's bringing back the goods that they had captured from Sodom. He's bringing back Lot and his family and all of these things. And we're told in verse 18 that Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine that there to meet Abraham or Abram. That he was the priest of the Most High God. And he, Melchizedek, blessed him, blessed Abram, and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he, Abram, gave him a tithe of all. So we find that Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. Now, if that was all you had, you'd be scratching your head and trying to wonder, well, who was this Melchizedek? And this is, by the way, the first example of tithing that is mentioned in the Scripture. And we see tithing introduced here as an ongoing practice, as an ongoing result. And nobody told Abraham here at this point, well, Abraham, you have to tithe. Abraham already understood tithing. He gave Melchizedek a tithe of all. Now, we learn about this Melchizedek when we go back to Hebrews chapter 7. And in Hebrews 7, we're told that this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham gave a tenth part of all, gave a tithe. First being translated king of righteousness. That's what the word Melchizedek means, king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem, which means king of peace. Well, here was a man whose name was king of righteousness, king of peace. Hebrews 7:3 tells us he was without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days or end of life. But made like the Son of God, remains, present progressive, remains a priest continually. So here's an individual without father, without mother, without beginning of days or end of life. One like the Son of God. Now, it emphasizes here in Hebrews 7 that how great this individual was, that in effect, the Levites, who were later commissioned to receive tithes, had in that sense paid tithes through their great-grandfather Abraham to Melchizedek. And we're told in verse 7, this individual Melchizedek was certainly far greater than Abraham, because beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Abram, the father of the faithful, was blessed by someone who was better than him, was blessed by Melchizedek. So we're told that, coming on here in Hebrews 7, that Christ is to be a priest forever. This is down in verse 21, according to the order of Melchizedek. Verse 24, because he continues forever, he has an unchangeable priesthood. So we find here that in reality the Melchizedek was none other than the one that we know as Jesus Christ, the one who appeared to Abraham back here and evidently had a location there at Salem, which is the ancient name of Jerusalem, that he came and dealt with Abraham, conveyed a blessing to him. Abraham tithed to him. And then, now there's a couple of examples. Anybody know right off the other place where tithing is mentioned in the book of Genesis? There are two examples of tithing here in the book of Genesis. Well, the other example is found back in Genesis 28. Jacob. That's right. Jacob was fleeing from Esau, and he came to a place called Bethel, and he slept there that night. He took this stone and made it for a pillow, and he slept there, and that night he had visions through the night of angels ascending and descending on a ladder from heaven to that location. And so when he rose up early in the morning, this is Genesis 28:18, took the stone, set it up as a pillar, poured oil on top, called the name of that place Bethel. Jacob made a vow, verse 20. He says, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I'm going and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone that I've set up as a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I'll surely give 1/10 to you. I'm going to start tithing. You talk about foxhole religion. You know, Jacob was fleeing from Esau. He was scared. He was getting out of there. He saw this, and he told God, Jacob, it's incredible. Jacob had this, he was always trying to cut a deal. You remember? That was the way he dealt with Esau. Now he's going to cut a deal with God. He says, I don't have time to really do a whole lot right now. But if you'll watch over me and take care of me and bring me back here safely, then the eternal shall be my God. I'm really going to get serious about this stuff. I'm really going to start, keeping the commandments. I'm going to start doing all the stuff I'm supposed to do. If you watch over me and bring me back here safely, then I'm really going to, I'll tell you what, I'm going to get serious about it. I'm even going to start tithing. I'll tithe. I'll do all the stuff. So, you see, tithing is introduced as an ongoing practice. Abraham did it. Jacob knew that was what converted people did. He understood that. He didn't guess at what the amount was. But Jacob had some lessons to learn. You see, and there is a tremendous amount, by the way, in the story of Jacob, if you want to just study the subject of conversion. There's a tremendous amount packed there as to how God worked with this man to bring him to repentance. First, he had to bring him to see himself. He had to humble him and bring him down to recognize his need for a Savior and for God's help. And Jacob ultimately, as we're going to see a little later, came to a far different attitude than he initially had. But anyway, we see the example here of tithing. As we go on looking at pursuing the story, in Genesis chapter 15, God again came to Abram in a vision, said, don't be afraid, I'm your shield, your exceeding great reward. And Abram said, well, what good is that going to do me? I'm going childless. The only heir I have now is my chief steward, Eliezer of Damascus. And God told him, no, he's not going to be your heir. Your heir will be one that comes forth from your own body. And he said, look now, verse 5, toward the heaven and count the stars if you're able to number. So shall your descendants be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And God said, I'm the eternal that brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. Well, God told him, he began to expand the promises even further in verse 18, where he told Abraham by covenant, I've given you this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, and the land of all these people that are dwelling here. So God continues to expand the promises and to give him more and more information about it. Well, time goes on. And as we read the story here in chapter 16, we find that 24 years have gone by from the time that Abram came out of Egypt. Well, not initially, though. Chapter 16 brings up the story that 10 years had gone by when we come to verse 3. He dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. And Sarah had come up with an idea. 10 years had gone by, and what are we going to do? We don't have any children. And Sarah decided that the solution was for Abraham to take her handmaid. And she gave Abraham her handmaid and told him, you have a child by her, and this will be our child. Well, needless to say, that led to problems. This wasn't the same as Sarah having a child. When Hagar realized that she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And now Sarah began to get upset. See, now you had a little jealousy going on. And Sarah told Abraham in verse 5, she said, "My wrong be upon you. It's all your fault." Well, and she tied into him, and Abraham said, he was figured that discretion was the better part of valor here, so he said, "Look, she's your handmaid. You do what you want to. I'm getting out of this thing." So Sarah began to deal harshly with her. Abraham decided that he better not get between them, and Sarah began to deal harshly. She was upset and frustrated and jealous, and Hagar fled. Well, an angel appeared and told Hagar to return to your mistress. Verse 9 of chapter 16, submit yourself to her, and I will multiply your descendants exceedingly. And of course, she had a child whose name was Ishmael. That's, we're told here in verse 15, Abraham was 86 when Hagar bore Ishmael. Abraham was 86. And so we find that God made a promise here. There's some prophecies relating to Ishmael. Genesis 16:12. That out of the New English Bible, I'll read it. "He shall be a man like the wild ass, and his hand against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all of his kinsmen," which is descriptive of the Arab people. That's what they've been. They have been a wild nomadic bunch, and they have continually fought with one another and everybody else. And they've stayed in the same general area, expanded out from there, and have a history of desert warfare all the way down. Now, there's a little more given in chapter 17, verse 20. We're told that Ishmael would become, his descendants would be greatly multiplied. He shall beget 12 princes. I'll make of him a great nation. Ishmael had 12 sons as well as Jacob did, and there are 12 tribes of Arabs. We don't have time to go into all the details, but the Arabs, interestingly, they have retained their genealogies. They have that. King Hussein of Jordan his claim to prominence is that he is a direct descendant of Mohammed. He is the he is in that sense sort of the person of greatest stature in the Arab world because of his connection with the Prophet Muhammad. But the genealogies among the Arabs go back way beyond Muhammad. They track. They know which of the tribes of Ishmael that they come from, and those tribes are sort of scattered in different areas there of the Middle East. They're all in the same general Arabic-speaking world. But the Arabs, because they have basically stayed in the same area with the same language, have preserved a history, both of themselves and of the peoples that they came in contact with, that is remarkable, more so than most any people, because most peoples have migrated from their original area and their languages have changed as time has gone on. Arabic is basically derived from Hebrew. They're very similar languages, and the Arabs say salam, and the Hebrew and the Jews say shalom. That's the similarity of the languages. So it's something that has put them in a unique situation to preserve much of the history there in that area. As we note here, there's 14-year difference in age between Ishmael and Isaac. We're told that Abraham was 86, chapter 16, verse 16, when Ishmael was born, and then in chapter 17, he was 99 when God appeared and made a covenant, promised him a son, Isaac. And so Abraham was told that Isaac was born. Then in the aftermath of that, Sarah said in verse 17 of chapter 17, "Shall a child be born to a man who's 100 years old, and shall Sarah, who is 90, bear a child?" This was just incredible that to Abraham and Sarah both. They couldn't, just was almost inconceivable, such a thing. But Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born, and Ishmael had been born when he was 86. So that makes a 14-year difference. Now, God established a physical sign of the covenant here in chapter 17. Abram was 99. The Eternal appeared to him and said, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. Be perfect. Be just like me. And I'll make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly. And God told him, my covenant is with you. Verse 4, you shall be a father of many nations. Your name shall no longer be called Abram, but now you shall be called Abraham. For I've made you a father of many nations. I'll make you exceedingly fruitful. Will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. Now, we saw earlier that he was going to give him a land and make of him a great nation. Now that's made plural. I will make nations of you. In fact, he changed his name to be Father of Many Nations. And we're told in verse 6 that a line of kings, a royal dynasty, would be established coming from the descendants of Abraham. So there are more details that are added to the promise. You ever thought about this? Here's Abraham. He's 99. He has no legitimate children. He has this one child by a handmaid, but he has no legitimate children. And now God makes a promise to him, tells him, I'm changing your name. So now Abraham's got to come out of the tent and announce to everybody that he's got a new name. From now on, I want you to call me Father of a Multitude. He's 99 and he doesn't have any kids. You talk about being an optimist. Father of a multitude. But God calls things that are not as though they were, because when God says it, it's as good as done. And so God changed his name, and now they introduced the covenant of circumcision. So, verse 23, Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all the males there among the men of Abraham's house, and they were all circumcised. And Abraham was 99 when he was circumcised. And Ishmael, verse 25, his son was 13. You realize that the Arabs practice circumcision to this day. They do as well as the Jews. Now, the Jews follow the instructions that God gave here, that they're to be circumcised on the 8th day. The Arabs don't do that. They don't circumcise on the 8th day. They circumcise in memory of Ishmael. And all the Arabs' males are circumcised when they're 13. So, anyway, another advantage to being a Jew rather than an Arab. So, God gave this as a sign of the covenant. Now, the Jews later placed an emphasis on circumcision as though circumcision were the means of justification. Circumcision, the sign of the covenant in the minds of the Jewish religious leaders of the first century of Christ's day, they considered that circumcision was necessary in order to come into the presence of God. That you couldn't have a relationship with God if you weren't circumcised, because you couldn't enter the temple. That was the sign of the covenant. Paul goes back to this section of Scripture and makes the point that Abraham had a relationship with God before he was ever circumcised. Circumcision was not the basis of his relationship with God. It was the aftermath of that. Abraham had a relationship with God. He trusted God. That was the basis of his relationship, was faith. And so when God asked him to be circumcised, he was. Circumcision was the result. It was something that Abraham did because God asked him to do it. The real key is having an attitude of submission, of trust and confidence and submission to God. And then that takes care of everything else, because when God asks us to do something, we respond in faith. If God wants us to do this, we do it. If God wants us to do that, we do it. You see, it's not the action that justifies us. It is the attitude, the faith, the confidence in trusting God. And therefore, we keep His commandments. We obey Him as a response to the fact that we trust Him, and we will do whatever it is that God desires of us. So God, here in chapter 18, there's more details given concerning the child that Abraham and Sarah were to have. They both laughed about it, and Sarah just laughed and laughed. She thought this was so funny, that she was going to have a child when she was old, and so God made her name the child Laugh. That's what Isaac means in Hebrew. Well, in Genesis 18, we find that when Abraham was sitting there in the plains of Mamre, that 18:2, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And as we come on down through the story, we find that one of these was the Lord. Verse 13, the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Verse 16, the men arose from there and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that which I'm doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation. You know, I know him. I know what he's going to do. He's going to teach his children. And they're going to follow the way of the Lord. They're going to keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness. That the Lord may bring to Abraham that which He's spoken. See, God knew that Abraham was going to do his part, which allowed the blessings to be fulfilled. So God began to explain to Abraham what He was going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. Their sin is very grievous. And here are 2 angels that are accompanying the Lord. That makes up the 3. Chapter 19, verse 1 talks about the 2 angels came to Sodom that evening. Now, God told him what He was going to do, and Abraham began to try and bargain with God. Now, the reason, of course, was that Abraham was worried about Lot. He was worried about Lot and his family. And so he says, you remember the story, well, what if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Would you destroy a place like that? I mean, maybe a lot of bad people. What if there are 50 righteous? You wouldn't slay the righteous with the wicked. God said, well, if I find 50 righteous people, I'll spare the whole place. Well, then Abraham begins to bargain a little bit. He says, well, what if it just lacked 5 being 50? I mean, 50, maybe it wasn't quite 50. Almost. It was 45. Surely just 5 people. Just the absence of 5 people, you wouldn't destroy it. God said, no. He said, well, what if there were just 40? I mean, you're not going to destroy it if they're 45. Well, what about if they're 40? And God said, no. He said, well, what about 30? And he works it all the way down, you see. Finally, God tells him that He wouldn't destroy it for the sake of 10. Abraham figured that was about as far as he dared go. He finally worked it down to 10. He figured Lot and his family ought to make up that many. Well, you remember the story. The angels came to Sodom, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Lot, by this time, was really gotten pretty involved there in Sodom. The gate of the city was sort of the focal point of activity, of commercial and legal activity. And Lot was there, and he saw these 2 strangers, and he bowed his face to the ground, and a sign of respect. And then he didn't realize who they were, but he recognized they were strangers. He knew enough about the area where he lived to know that this was not a good place for a stranger to just sort of come in unawares. So Lot invited them to spend the night with him, and strongly insisted, and so they did. And it's interesting the way certain things are sort of typed and made reference to in the Old Testament. Lot invited them in verse 2 to come spend the night at his house to wash your feet. And then we find that he baked unleavened bread, made a feast, baked unleavened bread here in verse 3. Well, you remember the story here. Wasn't long before the people of the land, the people of the city came, and they wanted these men to come out. Well, they were angels and able to take care of themselves. They struck the people blind that had come there to the house, told Lot that they had really seen all they needed to see. That down in verse 12, they said, do you have anybody here in the city? Son-in-law, sons, daughters, whoever you have, take them out of here. We're going to destroy this place. Well, Lot went out, verse 14, spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters, and he said, get out of this place, the Lord will destroy it. But, his sons-in-law considered it a joke. You see, their attitude, Lot now began to reap some of the consequences of what he had done. Abraham was very, very careful in terms of his family and had made great care and provision to send his most trusted servant, as we're going to see, all the way back to the land of the Chaldeans to get an appropriate wife for his son. Lot's family had intermarried here in Sodom, and the result of it, you see, was that Lot's whole family had been absorbed into the society. And there weren't 10 righteous. Lot's family, except for his 2 unmarried daughters that were there at home, him and his wife and his 2 unmarried daughters, they were the only ones living there in his house. And so finally the angels told him, you've got to get out. We can't wait any longer. In verse 16 it says, while he lingered. I think, you think about that. That's one of the most poignant verses, I think, in the Bible, because you know why Lot lingered. Because his family was there. And he knew what was going to happen to him when he walked out of Sodom. And that was very, very difficult. He had made some decisions earlier in life that were now coming back on him in terms of consequences. So the angels took hold of him. Oh, please don't make me go to the mountains. I'm scared. A little town over there, that's just a little place. Surely it can't be very bad. It's very little. Can I go over there? Well, the angel said, all right, you can go over there. Now hurry and escape. The name of the city was called Zoar, which means literally little. It was a little town. They called it little. It was just a little spot in the road. So the sun had risen when Lot entered Zoar, and the Lord rained fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. And he overthrew the cities of the plains and all the inhabitants. Now Lot's wife looked back. They were told not to look back when these things started happening. She looked back, and I think certainly the sense of it is she looked back longingly. She was, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, Christ quotes this in Matthew 24. He says, remember Lot's wife. One of those little short verses in the Bible. What should we remember about Lot's wife? This was had become so much her society and her world, she simply couldn't turn her back on it and leave it behind. She looked back. I think the clear implication is she looked back longingly. Well, Lot, verse 30, the more he got thinking about it, he went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains. All of a sudden the mountains didn't seem so bad. After the fire and brimstone had come down, everything had been destroyed. I guess Lot got thinking about it, and he got scared that maybe God was going to change his mind and wipe out Zoar too, because he had sure made a clean sweep of everything else. You go over there now, that's the area of the Dead Sea. It is a desolate, one of the most desolate places on earth. This is the place Lot moved because it was well watered. And you notice it adds in the parenthetical statement, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Appearances can be deceiving. And Lot was looking for some of the wrong things. Well, we go through the story here of Lot and his 2 daughters, and this is ultimately where the Moabites and the Ammonites, you read of them on throughout much of the rest of the Old Testament, but they were the children of Lot, the children of Lot by his daughters. And this is described here in Genesis 19. Now, as we come on down through the story, in chapter 21 we read of the birth of Isaac, and then the expulsion of Ishmael and Hagar, which is given here in Genesis 21. They were sent out. God intervened to take care of them. Now, as we come on down through the story, we need to pick up a little speed here. We'll come to chapter 22. God tested Abraham. God tested Abraham, and he said, I want you to take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham arose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, arose and went to the place which God had told him. Now understand, by this time, of course, Isaac is a grown man. I think every indication is that is the case. Isaac has reached maturity. Abraham has been walking with God for decades now. God began to work with him very directly when he was 75. God has appeared to him, has dealt with him. Abraham has had conversations with God face to face, the one that became Jesus Christ. actually eaten meals with him, as described there in Genesis 18, tithe to him, as it describes in Genesis 14 and other places. So, it's not that Abraham, it's not, somebody just sort of heard a voice in the dark that told him, go slay your son, and he did it. I mean, Abraham knew this was God. This was the Creator. This is the one that he had dealt with for all of these decades. He knew who it was. He had no question. He had no doubt that it was God. It wasn't just sort of some, disembodied voice that sometimes people, do some crazy thing. And they say, well, God told me to do that. Well, this was a totally different thing. God had dealt with Abraham in a personal way, time after time, over an extended period of years, of decades. And now the very one who had appeared to him, who had sat down and had a meal with him and said, now you're going to have a son in a year, had continued to deal with him through this time. Now this one appears to him and said, that son you had, the one I promised you, you need to take him and sacrifice. And Abraham, we're told, made preparation, and he did this. Now it's interesting when you read in Hebrews 11, it says that Abraham accounted that God was able to raise him from the dead. You see, God had made a promise that in Isaac shall your seed be called. So Abraham knew that it was impossible for God to lie. He didn't know how God was going to do this, but he trusted God completely, totally. And you're familiar with the story. They came there to the land of Moriah, which is the environs of Jerusalem. Now, the Temple Mount is called Mount Moriah. Some think that was where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. I think if you read verse 2 of chapter 22, it's a little more general than that. It says, the land of Moriah, one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. I frankly think that it's more likely, given the symbolism, that it was actually the mount called Golgotha. Because when I don't think we can totally prove that, but notice what Abraham named it here. He lifted up his eyes and saw the ram, and he named the place, verse 14, Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide. As it is said today, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Well, who was provided? What was provided? Well, Christ. This was a type, you see, because God the Father ultimately gave His only begotten Son. See, God did what He asked Abraham to do. He didn't require Abraham to do it. But God the Father actually did this, and the name of the place is the Lord will provide. That's why I think that it was probably on the actual location of Christ's crucifixion, which, of course, is only a matter of a short distance from the Temple Mount. All of it is in the environs there, the same immediate area. It's all in what would have been termed the land of Moriah. Verse 2 just is general. It doesn't say, it just says one of the mountains there. Well, there are all these little hills there around Jerusalem. Which one was it? I think, of course, ultimately that was the most significant place in terms of the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice taking place, the one of which what Abraham did with Isaac and then with the ram were only types. Now God said at this point, now I know, verse 12, that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son. So God says in verse 16, by myself I have sworn, because you've done this, in blessing I'll bless you, multiplying I'll multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. So we find here the promises were made unconditional based on Abraham's obedience. And now the promises are expanded a little further. The promise is added in for the first time, your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. And they're going to be multiplied. So we find here the little update on the family. Abraham got family news about what had happened to the family back in the land that he had left. And Sarah then died. She was 127. That means that Isaac would have been 37. He was 90. Sarah was 90 when Isaac was born. So Isaac would have been 37 at this point. And she died, and Abraham buried her. He spoke to the sons of Heth, and he says, I'm a foreigner and a sojourner among you, a stranger and a pilgrim. I want to buy a place to bury my dead. Well, they offered to give him a place, and he said, no, I want to pay for it. And so it gives the story here. He bought this. This is the only part of the promised land Abraham ever owned in his lifetime, and he had to pay for it. Now, God had promised him all this. But you see, Hebrews 11 tells us Abraham died in faith, not having yet received the promises. He saw them afar off, was persuaded of them. You know, that is a tremendous lesson of faith. Abraham waited his whole life. And he died in faith, still trusting that God was going to do what he said. That is a remarkable example. Because, you know, patience doesn't come very easily to most of us. Our general attitude seems to be, Lord, give me patience and give it to me right now. You know, and patience is something that is tied in with faith, and it has to be developed over a period of time. Now, as we come on into chapter 24, Abraham was old. God had blessed him. And Abraham called his most trusted servant and said, I want you to go back to my country and to get a wife for my son. Abraham understood that, it was important who Isaac married. He didn't want him to intermarry with the Canaanites there in the land. And he said, told his servant to go back. And the servant, verse 10, took 10 of his master's camels and departed. His master's goods were in his hand. Now here was a profitable servant. Here was a trusted servant. You know, Abraham entrusted all this wealth to him to go back there, trusting the servant was going to go where he was supposed to go, not to head out for Egypt or try to escape or something. Well, as you come on to down through the story, you know, the servant had prayed to God and asked him to give success. And so sure enough, God sent out a young woman, Rebekah, who was a granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. And she came there, and she was a beautiful young woman, and she and the servant had conversation. When he realized who she was, he went back there. Now Rebekah had a brother, verse 29, whose name was Laban. And as we come on down through the story, Abraham's servant told him why he had come. Now this is not a forced marriage. That I think that's good to understand. Rebekah had a choice, and that is made plain as you come on down through the chapter. That verse 58, they called Rebekah and said, "Will you go with this man?" And she said, "I will go." So it was not a forced marriage in the sense that some sometimes had the idea. Rebekah had a choice. She could have refused. She chose to go. And so they sent away Rebekah and her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they came back there, and Isaac saw Rebekah, we're told, and Isaac took Rebekah as his wife. He loved her, we're told here in verse 67. Now, in the chapter 25 tells about another wife that Abraham took now after the death of Sarah and the children that he had by her. But we're told in verse 5, Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Isaac was his heir. He gave gifts to the sons of the concubines, and while he was still living, he sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son. And Abraham died, 175. Isaac and Ishmael buried him. And then we get into the story of Ishmael and Isaac. It talks about some of the genealogy here of Ishmael here in the remainder of chapter 25. And then we come on down that Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah. He'd been 37, if you remember, when his mother died. They were unable to have children for a period of time, but Isaac besought God for her, and Rebekah conceived, and she bore twins. And these twins were not identical twins by any means. They were very different. God had plans for them. There were two nations that were there, and the twins were born, Jacob and Esau. Esau came out first. Jacob came out, and he was holding Esau by the heel. They took two totally different approaches to life. Esau was a hunter, a man of the field. Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. Esau was Isaac's favorite, and Jacob was Rebekah's favorite, and that led to problems. Well, as we find the story here that as to how Jacob had this trait of he was a fellow who was always out to wheel and deal, and to try to take advantage of the situation. He managed to get the birthright away from Esau, con Esau into selling his birthright for a bowl of stew. And as we come on down in chapter 27, we find that Isaac was old and his eyes were dim, and he wanted Esau to go and make him a venison stew, a savory stew like he liked, spicy, tasty. And Rebekah heard it. She knew that Isaac was going to convey the blessing at this point, so she and Jacob cooked up a scheme to take a goat and to roast that, and she seasoned it up. And by the time she seasoned it and spiced it all up, Isaac couldn't tell the difference. You remember the story, Jacob passed himself off as Esau and got the blessing. So he was a real wheeler-dealer. He's not the kind of fellow you'd want to get into business with. He's not the kind of fellow you'd want to buy a used car from. Jacob was always out to get the best end of the deal. Well, the result of this was sort of the final straw, because we're told in verse 41 that Esau hated Jacob. And Esau said, "The days of mourning for my father are at hand, and then I'm going to kill Jacob. Dad can't live very much longer. As soon as he dies, I'm going to finish Jacob off. I'm going to kill him." And Jacob figured that Esau meant it. So Rebekah was worried, and they decided, she talked to Isaac, and they decided that they needed to send Jacob away. Jacob and Rebekah had both been grieved by Esau's marriages. He had taken wives of the Hittites, and we're told in verse 35 of chapter 26, they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. And down in verse 46 of chapter 27, Rebekah said to Isaac, "I'm weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth." I'm just sick about what's happened, the way what Esau has done. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, like those that are the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? I don't even want to live if this is going to happen. So Isaac called Jacob, blessed him, and said, "Don't take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there, of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." And so Jacob was sent away by Isaac, and he went. And Esau never did get the point. Verse 8, he finally figured out the daughters of Canaan didn't please his father. So then he went to Ishmael and married some Ishmaelites in addition to the wives that he already had. Well, Esau was not real good at getting the point on things, as we see in several examples. But Jacob went on down. We've already went through the account here of God appearing to him. Jacob came in chapter 29. We have the account of Jacob meeting Laban and coming to love Rachel and wanting to marry her. Well, you remember the story that Laban pulled a switch on him. Jacob had made a deal to work 7 years and be able to marry Rachel. And when the 7 years were up, Laban passed the older daughter, Leah, off on him, and then said, "Oh, you didn't know? Well, in our country," this is verse 26 of chapter 29, we can't give the younger one before the older one." "Oh, I thought you knew that." "No, we got this custom." "Well, I'll tell you what. Oh, you want to marry her? Well, serve me another 7 years." And Jacob did so. And so we're told, verse 30, Jacob went into Rachel. He loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. Well, as we come on down through the story, we find that after he had served this period of 14 years, then he served another 6 working for wages. Because Laban didn't want to let him go. Jacob was a very good farm manager. Well, we go through the story here, beginning in verse 31, coming on down. The children that Jacob had through his wives. And then they made a deal to Jacob asked Laban to send me away that I may go to my own place, to my own country. And Laban said, "Oh, I want you to stay. You just name your wages and I'll give it." Verse 28. So they made a deal for the livestock as to which ones would belong to Jacob and which ones would belong to Laban. Well, as you go on through the story, Jacob told him down in verse 41 of Genesis 31, "I've been in your house 20 years. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And you've changed my wages 10 times. You know, every time that Jacob started getting ahead, Laban tried to go back and rewrite the contract. You ever did business with somebody like that? You know. So anyway, God finally extricated him from the situation. It was good for Jacob to be in a spot that he couldn't get himself out of. You know, sometimes we changes our perspective on things. Verse 42 says, "Unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely now you'd have sent me away empty-handed." You know, Laban didn't let him go with anything because he wanted to. Well, as you come on down through the story, we find that Jacob returned, and Jacob sent messengers. See, this was the thing he was nervous about. He was going back, and he was going to have to face Esau. And so he sent word to Esau and sent gifts, and he was concerned. He was greatly distressed. See, because he got word, verse 6. Messengers returned to Jacob and said, "We came to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you. And he's got 400 men with him." Well, that was, what Jacob was afraid of. Your brother's coming, and he's bringing 400 men. Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people and the flocks into 2 hands. Now notice his prayer, verse 9. You remember we read that earlier where he was bargaining with God. "If you'll bring me back and take care of me, I'll do this, this, and this." Verse 9, Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your kindred, and I'll deal well with you.' I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies of all the truth. I'm not worthy of the least of your mercies and of all the truth which you've shown your servant. I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I've become 2 companies." Notice an attitude of humility. He says, "God, I know I don't deserve this. I don't deserve the least of your mercy. I don't deserve the truth that you've given me. You've given me your truth, and you've dealt with me very mercifully. You've blessed me. I left with nothing, and now look at all the things that I have. But please deliver me from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mother and the children." And so he really besought God. Now God tested him, because we find Jacob was left alone. Everybody had crossed the brook. He was left alone, verse 24, "And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. When he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled. He said, 'Let me go, the day breaks.' And Jacob said, 'I won't let you go unless you bless me.' He said, 'What's your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' He says, 'Your name is no longer to be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed.'" You know, prevailer or overcomer with God. That's what Israel means. And Jacob called the name of the place, verse 30, he called it Peniel. "For I've seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." Well, Jacob met Esau returning, coming there, and God gave him favor with Esau. Jacob came safely into the land of Canaan. Verse 18, he came safely there to the land of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. And he bought a parcel of land, pitched his tent. Now, Jacob didn't initially go to Bethel, which is where he had left from and where he'd made the promises and the covenant with God, years earlier. He came there, settled down, and he intended to go to Bethel. He intended to do all this stuff, You ever find yourself in a spot like that where you really have good intentions, but you sort of get sidetracked? Jacob got sidetracked. He got settled down and found a place for his cattle, and, he thought he had things he had to take care of. And he was taking care of it all right. One of the things he wasn't taking care of very carefully was his family. And Dinah, his daughter, began to go out to see the daughters of the land. Well, that was a mistake. It wasn't long before she had gotten, sort of entangled in an illicit romance with Hamor, with Shechem, who was the prince of the country, and they became involved in fornication. And Shechem wanted to marry her, so he and Hamor, his father, came and asked Jacob to give them his daughter. Well, this wasn't what ought to be. And when the sons of Jacob, verse 7, when they came in from the field and heard it, they were grieved and angry. And Hamor said, he said, verse 9, make marriages with us and give your daughters to us and take our daughters to yourself. We'll just be all one people. And this was not, of course, what was supposed to be. Well, Jacob's sons answered Shechem and Hamor deceitfully, verse 13. And they said, well, look, I tell you what, the only reason we're slow to do this is because you're uncircumcised. That was not the whole story, but they said, if you'll all be circumcised, then we'll do this. Well, we're told that they got everybody to agree to be circumcised. And so, verse 25, it came to pass on the third day when they were in pain. The two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took his sword, came boldly into the city, and killed all the males. So they slaughtered and plundered and did all this stuff. And when Jacob heard it, he said, you have really gotten me into trouble now. We're few in number, and all these Canaanites all around are going to hear about this, and they're going to destroy us. Well, Simeon and Levi didn't seem to be very repentant, verse 31. They figured they were justified. And down in verse 35, Jacob has now gotten in this is a real mess. I mean, here they are about to be on the receiving end of this of a war that was about to break out. And God told Jacob in chapter 35, verse 1, he says, you need to arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar to God who appeared to you when you fled. He sort of called Jacob's attention to something. He said, Jacob, you and I have a deal, remember? I think maybe you need to go back to Bethel. You need to go back to where you entered into your covenant with me. Your life is not very well in control. Things have become pretty well unmanageable for you, haven't they? You need to go back to Bethel. Now, it's interesting because Jacob knew there were compromises Jacob had allowed in his family. We know that because when they got ready to go back to Bethel, Jacob knew. You see, Jacob didn't have a Protestant idea, the Protestant saying, just as I am. Well, Jacob knew that he couldn't come back to Bethel just as he was. He had some changes to make. If he wanted to go to Bethel and renew his covenant with God, so he called his household together and he said, put away the foreign gods that are among you. Purify yourselves and change your garments. Because we've got to get rid of all these little idols. Various family members had little idols that they had. And Jacob said, let us arise and go to Bethel, and I'll make an altar to God who answered me in the day of my distress. So they gave Jacob their foreign gods, which were in their hands. And, his sons gave him their earrings. That was something that they had picked up from the Ishmaelites, who had picked it up from down in Egypt. That's a different subject. We could go through some other verses back in Joshua on that. But, all these little compromises they had made with the society around them, and Jacob dug a hole and he buried them here under a tree in Shechem. All their little idols and all their little things, you see. They wanted to be just like the world and just sort of, and they were. Well, they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities round about them. I think it's an interesting thing to understand, and there's a spiritual principle. There's a time, I think, in all of our lives when we come to the point of realizing that maybe we need to arise and go back to Bethel. We need to get back to our spiritual beginnings. We need to get back, we need to renew our relationship with God. And the principle here is that at that point, that's the time to examine our lives and say, what kind of trash have we picked up and accumulated in our journey? What kind of things do we need to discard? What do we need to bury under the oak tree and leave behind us? Because Jacob knew that if they were really going to get serious in renewing a relationship with God, that they couldn't just go on like they were, just sort of living a life of compromise with the world around. So he came to Luz, or Bethel, built the altar there. And God appeared to Jacob again. And we made reference to the fact that his name was now Israel, told him, be fruitful and multiply. Now he expands the promise a little further. Verse 11, a nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you. See, that's never been mentioned before. Promise is reiterated. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I'll give to you and your descendants. So they journeyed from Bethel, and they came to Ephrath, or Ephrata, the area of Bethlehem. Ephrata was the old name. Bethlehem was a later name. That's why you find references to people from the area of Bethlehem called Ephrathites. Has reference to Ephrata, which was the ancient name of the city. Rachel travailed in childbirth. She had a son, Benjamin, and died and was buried there. That's Bethlehem was always associated as sort of Rachel's city because she was buried there. This chapter also makes reference here to, Genesis 35:22 makes reference that as to what Reuben had done to disqualify himself as being receiving the birthright, that he had committed adultery with his father's concubine. The references in Genesis 35:22, and if you want a cross-reference, you can go back to 1 Chronicles 5:1, where it makes plain that that was why he was disqualified from the birthright. Chapter 36 gives the genealogy of Esau. So with that, we have, I think, had an overview of this section this evening. We're going to finish up Genesis next time. This time I will